You, not us. Hatred is a really thrilling feeling. Darling, I think I'm going to die because I detest you so much. From the 1940s to the 1960s, Glenn Ford was Hollywood's most famous star. He co-starred with Rita Hayworth, B. Davis, and Marlon Brando in over 100 parts over 50 years. And in 1958, he was the top earner at the box office. However, you will never get a true picture of the guy he was if you just see the glory. Although he never married her, Glenn loved one woman to the end of his life. Despite having a son, he abandoned him for almost 50 years. He had affairs with hundreds of celebrities and was married 4 times. To prevent a nurse from putting a do not resuscitate order on his hospital bed, his son ultimately had to go to court. He gave legendary performances in Blackboard Jungle, The Big Heat, and Gilda, before passing away peacefully by himself in a hospital room that no one seemed to care about. Although he wasn't a horrible man, Glenn Ford wasn't the type of man that most people would want as a spouse, parent, or lover. He was one of the most tragic and complicated characters in Hollywood history because of his internal inconsistencies and irreparable errors. A legend who remained silent until his son documented everything. Glenn Ford, whose full and official name was Guion Samuel Newton Ford, was born on May 1916, in the village of Port-Neuf, Quebec, Canada. There was nothing normal about the blood in his veins. His mother's line was derived from Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, while his father was a cousin of Sir John Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister. Glenn was positioned between 2 worlds from birth. One is based on custom and prestige, while the other is pursuing aspirations across national boundaries. Glenn's life would be shaped by his family's decision to leave Canada and go to Santa Monica, California, in 1924 when he was only 8 years old. The child, who was born in Canada, made his stage debut there under the bright Pacific Coast sun. For the first time, Glenn experienced the allure of inhabiting someone else's story and changing into a different person during school performances at Santa Monica High School. Maybe he also learned how to conceal his own from that point on. Glenn joined local theater organizations along the West Coast after graduating in 1934. He was poor, yet he had a worker's hands. In his spare time, he patched up his family's house, worked as a carpenter, an electrician, and a construction worker. His strict railroad boss father insisted that he pick up a trade in case Hollywood didn't need you. Nobody foresaw that Hollywood needed Glenn Ford, not the real man, but the idealized version of him that viewers wanted to believe in. He tried out for 20th Century Fox in 1937, but was turned down. He failed once more a year later. He didn't give up, though. The name Glenn Ford was transformed from a little Canadian village into a symbol on the American film industry by Columbia Pictures. Glenn Ford formally agreed to a long-term deal with Columbia Pictures in 1939. Harry Kahn, the head of the studio, made a daring but well-thought-out decision. Kahn made the decision to develop Columbia's own talent, rather than acquiring performers from other studios, as he had done in the past. William Holden was selected in addition to Glenn. One of them will survive, and the other will be devoured, Harry Kahn said simply. He didn't anticipate that the two would become best friends and become well known together. Although it wasn't a simple beginning, Glenn's first major role was in the movie Heaven with a barbed wire fence. On the set, director Ricardo Cortez publicly made fun of him, labeling him a bad actor and promising never to collaborate with him again. The old resentment remained strong when Glenn ran into him at a diner years later and almost struck him. However, in Hollywood, one innovation has the power to completely alter the landscape. And for Glenn Ford, that was the year that he and Rita Hayworth made cinema history in 1946, with the release of Gilda. Rita represented sex in her era. Glenn was the ideal counterpoint because of his subtle, quiet manner. Although Rita received the majority of the attention, audiences were deeply affected by Glenn's performance. Following that movie, the two developed a complicated, eerie friendship that would last for 40 years. Glenn's career took off after Gilda. He starred in several iconic movies. He was nominated for an Oscar for his work as a noir investigator in The Big Heat, 1953. At 1955, Blackboard Jungle co-founded the genre of educational dramas with Sidney Poitier, while working as a teacher at a chaotic school. In 1956, Marlon Brando starred in the satirical comedy Tea House of the August Moon, 310 to Yuma 1957, and Cowboy 1958, confirming his Western film prowess with practical horseback riding and shooting abilities. Glenn Ford rose to the top of the American box office in 1958, An uncommon accolade for an actor who always kept a cool, collected demeanor and shunned flamboyance and big scandals. With parts in Cimarron 1960, The Courtship of Eddie's Father 1963, The Rounders 1965, and Heaven with a Gun 1969, Glenn persevered through the mixed quality of the 1960s. He made the switch to television as the attention on film started to fade, and he continued to be successful throughout the 1970s, with shows including Once an Eagle, The Family HVAC, and Cads County. In Superman, the movie 1978, he made a brief but profoundly poignant cameo as Superman's adopted father, Jonathan Kent, which served as his final film high point. Just a glance, no fancy lines, no motions. And Glenn, who embodied poise, steadfastness, and calm compassion, won over the audience's hearts once more. He played a few supporting parts in his later years, including in the 1979 film Day of the Assassin. However, everyone was aware Glenn Ford's heyday was over, and the shadows of unredeemed things loomed ahead of him. The self he never quite forgiven, the son he once left behind, and the woman he loved. Many celebrities decided to support their country by selling war bonds or entertaining the troops when America joined World War II. This is what Glenn Ford did until he abruptly told the director on the set of Destroyer 1943, "I can't keep just playing a soldier." He then volunteered for the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. Hollywood was taken aback by the decision. The head of Columbia Pictures, Harry Kahn, was incensed. He was in the process of making Glenn the biggest star in the studio. Glenn, however, decided to go. Instead of merely playing a soldier on film, he wanted to be one. He did not, however, have a complete heroic arc throughout life. Glenn quickly encountered significant health issues. After being assigned to the Marine Corps' Public Relations Branch, he was deemed unfit for deployment after doctors found that he had a duodenal ulcer, which caused excruciating pain and kept him in the hospital for 5 months. It was a silent disappointment that he never discussed, as he longed to prove his true value. He went back to film after being released in 1944. Glenn Ford, however, always took pleasure in his service. Despite never having seen battle, he remained in the Naval Reserve, rising to the rank of lieutenant commander before being assigned to cultural outreach and military communications. For helping civilians escape the Nazis during the war, Glenn received the French government's highest honor, the Legion of Honor, in 1992, over 50 years later. Through films, fundraising trips, and humanitarian activities, in the years following the war, he demonstrated his image, spirit, and alignment with justice, not with a weapon. For the remainder of his life, Glenn Ford lived with that soldier's code, even though he never fired a gun in combat. Calm, responsible, and occasionally too alone to seek assistance. In his personal life, however, he was a man who couldn't hold on to anyone, even if the military acknowledged him as a committed serviceman. Admiration was sparked by his glow, yet it also drove loved ones away, and another tragedy began at that point. Silent, long-lasting, and deeper than any battleground, love, marriage, and a father-son relationship that never fully recovered. Glenn Ford made his acting debut in the 1940 movie, The Lady in Question, opposite a charming young actress. She went by Rita Hayworth. Neither of them was well known at the time. Even though they were just starting their careers, there was a natural synergy between them that went beyond their performances. It was a cinematic electricity that stayed on the screen, in quiet and flickered in glances. When they reconnected in Gilda, 1946, 6 years later, they had both grown emotionally and artistically. Gilda rose to fame, and an unnamed romance started between them. Glenn reportedly remarked, "I never saw Gilda as a movie. It was a memory." Rita, who had always been alone and famous, discovered in Glenn a calm safety that she had never had before. However, timing was against them. Rita was married to Edward Judson when Glenn wasn't. Glenn was already married to Eleanor Powell at the time of Rita's divorce. She then married Prince I. Khan and Orson Welles. Even though they were always out of rhythm, they continued to find their way back to one another. Rita told Glenn that the block of land next door had recently been put up for sale when she and her then-husband, screenwriter James Hill, lived in their Beverly Hills house. Glenn made no hesitation. He purchased it and constructed a new home right next to Rita's backyard wall. Rita then filed for divorce the day after Glenn moved in. Though nobody said, everyone understood. To allow Rita to pass at any time without the media noticing, Glenn put a little gate in the rear fence. They lived like nameless lovers in the middle of Hollywood, sharing breakfasts and lounging by Glenn's pool. Glenn is the best neighbor a woman could ask for, Rita joked to the media, in 1972. But there was more to that smile than that. They were everything to each other, but never truly each other. Despite the many other affairs that followed, Glenn Ford never forgot Rita, claiming that every film she starred in was one of his favorites, and that he always loved her. When Rita started losing her memory in 1981, doctors determined that she had early-onset Alzheimer's, a sign of Hollywood beauty and vivacity, and that she was gradually losing everything, including herself. Glenn stayed by her side, quietly supporting her and taking care of her, until her death in 1987 at the age of 68, when he was one of the pallbearers slowly walking behind her casket without speaking or crying. In a documentary about Rita Hayworth's life, Glenn once remarked, "A part of her will always live in me." No one ever knew exactly what happened between them over those 40 years, but they were never truly apart, even though they never married or shared a home. If Rita Hayworth was the woman Glenn Ford never married but loved deeply, then Eleanor Powell was the woman he married, but never really loved in the proper manner. To viewers, that may have been the most beautiful and tragic love story Hollywood ever kept buried in the shadows. Glenn, who was in the military at the time, met Eleanor, Hollywood's reigning tap dance queen, at a war bond fundraising party in 1943. She had once outshined even her co-stars in MGM's grand musicals, and Glenn was enthralled by her strength, grace, and selfless heart. They married less than a year later, although he continued to live with his mother and she with hers. Eleanor, at the height of her fame, gave up the stage, the audience, and the applause to become Glenn Ford's wife and mother of their only child, Peter, born in 1945. They moved into a 22-room mansion in Beverly Hills after the wedding, which is both a symbol of Glenn's ascent from the working class and the place where she ended her artistic career. However, her devotion was insufficient to keep Glenn grounded as he entered the prime of his career. While Eleanor devoted her life to their family, Glenn engaged in a series of extramarital affairs, ranging from brief romances to co-stars on set. Although the precise number is unknown, Peter Ford claims that his father recorded more than 140 private conversations with a variety of Hollywood celebrities, including Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, Joan Crawford, and Geraldine Brooks. Eleanor lived upstairs in that grand 3-story house. Glenn stayed on the ground floor, and their son Peter lived in the middle with his grandmother Hannah, a family of 3 under one roof. There were no violent fights or public breakdowns, but what hurt Eleanor the most was the long, inexplicable coldness. Peter would later remember, "My father didn't hug me, didn't talk to my mother, but none of them impacted the other's reality. He simply showed up when he had to and then disappeared." Eleanor quietly filed for divorce in 1959, just as Peter turned 14, after 16 years of a marriage that wasn't really a marriage. Glenn signed the papers without protest, as if the rest of her life was spent making amends for a love that came at the wrong time with the wrong man. Eleanor quietly dedicated herself to charity, raising her son, and doing religious work. She took her son with her, but never the heart of the man she had once sacrificed everything for. Eleanor never married again or loved anyone else for the next 23 years. Glenn didn't go to the funeral because he was too busy, or perhaps he didn't know how to handle it. She died of cancer in 1982, and her ashes were buried in a plain brass urn at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. There was no lavish service or media presence, just Peter, the boy she once referred to as the only reason to keep going. The only child of Glenn Ford's hundreds of women was named Peter Newton Ford, and he grew up in a home where his father was little more than a shadow. Eleanor Powell filed for divorce in 1959 and was awarded custody. Glenn didn't challenge this decision, nor did he maintain contact. "My father loved women, loved his job, loved everything but being a father." Glenn sent a small monthly support check, just enough to keep him from being called irresponsible, but never enough to fill the void of an empty childhood. Glenn was virtually non-existent during Peter's early years. No letters, no phone calls, no advice when his son first faced the world. Peter once remarked, "He was my father biologically, but he wasn't there." Even more bitter was the fact that Glenn and Peter frequently worked together, particularly on the television series Cad's County in the 1970s. But on set, they were two coworkers, more distant than strangers. While he starred in movies as brave men and loving fathers, and Peter lived with his mother and grandmother in a home where the past never quite rested. Then time did what no one could stop. Glenn grew old, lost the ability to walk after a series of strokes. His memory started to fail. He needed a wheelchair, and he became totally dependent on others. It was during this time that he called Peter back, not as a son, but simply as someone he needed help from. There were no hugs, no shared meals after filming, and no proud look from a father to his son. With the only person who called him dad, Glenn started telling stories no one had heard. Affairs long hidden, fears never confessed, a life lived to the fullest, but never lived truthfully. And Peter started asking. But now they were all under one roof once more, with no separate floors. Just a broken father and a son trying to make sense of his life, surrounded by the sound of medical machines and the shards of a fading memory. For the first time, my father looked at me for a long time, then said, "Do you remember when you were little?" And that's when I knew he was trying to make things right. Late, but sincere, Peter recalled in a subsequent interview. Peter published the memoir Glenn Ford, A Life, 2011, following Glenn's passing, not to pass judgment or exact retribution, but to share the tale his father had decided to keep secret all of his life. A man who was formerly adored by the most stunning women, and appreciated by everyone. In the end, though, all he could do was ask the son he had once deserted to write two things for him that he would never be able to express himself. I get it. Hollywood held Glenn Ford in the highest regard during his prime. However, in his last years he had changed from the Glenn Ford that the public had known. No longer a calm stare, erect stance, keen recall, or a kind, grounded grin. Glenn started having a string of more severe strokes after turning 70. His body stopped obeying him. His memory began to haze, and his neurological system began to fail. Once a man who walked boldly across movie sets, he was now totally dependent on others and used a wheelchair. Instead of living with his son at this period, Glenn lived with Pauline Kernan, a considerably younger private nurse who was employed on a full-time basis. However, suspicion quickly set in. Peter Ford claims that his father had total faith in Pauline. Glenn had changed his will to exclude almost all of his family members and leave her the most of his estate. The tipping point occurred when Peter learned that, despite Glenn's continued lucidity, communication, and obvious desire to live, Pauline had obtained a "do not resuscitate" DNR order outside of Glenn's hospital room. Peter had to appear in court to defend his father's right to life, not to quarrel over money. Following the hearing, Pauline was removed as Glenn's medical proxy. The DNR order was revoked, and the care parameters were updated. It was more than just a court case. It was the last time a son would have to face the specter of a father who had been emotionally aloof all of his life. Glenn personally invited Peter and his family to move in with him after the incident. By then, he was no longer a movie star, a lovely lover, or a father who neglected his children. He was merely an elderly guy, weak and deformed, holding on to what little was left in the one embrace that had at last been extended to him. Glenn lived in peace for a few more years. He ceased to write, to perform, and to give interviews. There was simply the sound of wheels on tile, the faint buzz of a breathing machine, and sighs vanishing like mist at the end of the day in the Beverly Hills house that had once been a haven of love with Rita, and reverberated with Peter's early laughter. 4:00 p.m. Glenn Ford passed away quietly on August 30, 2006. He was 90 years old. The ashes of his cherished dog, Bismar, the devoted four-legged companion who had always slept by his bedside, were interred with him in Woodland Cemetery in Santa Monica at his wish. There was no lavish funeral or farewell from Hollywood. A quiet conclusion, but not a humorous one, because he would always be a symbol to the audience. In his own eyes, however, his life may have been a protracted quest for forgiveness. From the men he never really reconciled with, the women he loved, and the son he abandoned. A loud star was never Glenn Ford. He refrained from making ostentatious gestures, waving his arms on screen, or engaging in the publicity game in real life. Glenn's transformation into the type of performer that a whole generation of American audiences once trusted, identified with, and perceived as a reflection of themselves, was made possible by this. He portrayed the father in Superman, the Western farmer in Cowboy, the instructor in Blackboard Jungle, and the police officer in The Big Heat. He didn't overpower the audience in any part. When he failed, he made them feel comfortable, intimate, and grieved in private. Glenn Ford was once referred to by critics as the ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances. He wasn't James Dean, Marlon Brando, or Clark Gable. However, he was Glenn Ford, the kind of man that every viewer thought was real, and the scene partner that everyone aspired to work with. Glenn Ford starred in more than 100 films, in almost every genre over his more than 50-year career. Westerns, 310 to Yuma, The Fastest Gun Alive, Jubal, comedies, The Tea House of the August Moon, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, social drama, Blackboard Jungle, The Doctor and the Girl, film noir, Gilda, The Big Heat, and even superhero movies. The 1978 film Superman. He was America's top-grossing movie star in 1958. Few actors maintained this distinction for longer than a year. For 4, he held it. Unfortunately, hardly many people today remember Glenn Ford. Hollywood Boulevard is devoid of imposing monuments. After his death, there was no elaborate memorial. No resuscitation efforts for his iconic movies, such as those for John Wayne or Humphrey Bogart. Peter Ford once remarked, "My father was incredibly famous until he died. It might have been because Glenn avoided controversy at all costs. No public outbursts, scandals, or terrible demises like so many other icons. Glenn Ford departed from this world in the same manner that he entered it, silently, resolutely, and without pleading for recognition. And because his legacy is not found in statues or rituals, it is precisely that attribute that qualifies him for commemoration. It permeates every scene in which he merely existed without acting, a spare line, a lingering look. A man who was painfully, hauntingly real, but never flawless. Being a legend was never Glenn Ford's goal. He never fought for recognition, never dazzled on stage, and never exploited his suffering to control public opinion. However, that is precisely the reason he became one of the most difficult musicians to forget. His life was a sequence of paradoxes between light and shade, between love and distance, and between the publicly admired man and the one his family never truly knew. If you sit quietly and gaze behind the curtain. He was unable to marry the lady he loved for 40 years. When time was almost out, he returned and begged for forgiveness, after abandoning his only child. Achieved the height of fame, and then quietly vanished into obscurity. Hollywood might not remember his name. The movies that brought him fame might be in storage now. However, you've already touched a part of Glenn Ford's history. If you've ever seen Gilda, been moved by his stare in The Big Heat, felt his presence in Blackboard Jungle, or felt comforted by his role as Superman's father, a legacy of the mere fact that a man like that previously lived, rather than of honors or trophies. Silent, tough, and dotted with invisible wounds. If you think that people who live true to themselves to the end, like Glenn Ford, should be recognized, appreciated, and remembered, then you're right. Then tell this tale. Have you ever watched a movie directed by Glenn Ford? What aspects of him do you recall? So that his name doesn't fade into obscurity, please leave us a comment. For more untold, fascinating tales about the legends you like, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.